Hey everybody, I've got a special presentation today. Joining me today is Marvin Haines, one of our dear friends of the channel. Marvin, you're a pretty special person. Let me introduce you and then we can get started on this presentation that you've put together specifically for this episode. So Marvin Haines, 16 years old, man of many talents.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're an aspiring author, aspiring composer, developing expert in late Victorian American architecture, especially for your native Portland, Oregon. And this presentation today is focused on a city we hardly ever talk about here. We're usually focused on St. Louis, but today we're going to focus on Portland, Oregon, because that happens to be where Marvin resides. One thing I just want to say, a couple things before you get going here, Marvin. When I say aspiring author, Marvin sends me his short stories and book, and he's writing a book. I've been reading it. It's quite good. Marvin is a very smart author. Yes. Composer, Marvin sends me and several other YouTubers some of the things that he composes. So man of several talents. And then you have been interested in architecture for a long time, right, Marvin? When did you start developing that interest?
Well, as long as I can remember, really. I'd like to thank my grandpa for inspiring me with his Second Empire style house in Cincinnati. He's spent a lot of time renovating it. Not all of the renovations are exactly what I would have done, but he's a very talented gentleman, and he does incredible wood paneling and all sorts of late Victorian inspired interiors. And I used to visit him when I was very little, and I used to just explore everywhere in that house, and it was fascinating for me.
Well, this has led to you spending a lot of time researching different architectural styles in your native hometown of Portland, and you have put together this presentation for us today that I can't wait to see, and it's about a little known location in Portland called Nob Hill, and I think it's underappreciated from what you've told me. So
I would agree with that.
Great. So Marvin, why don't you just take this away and start to talk to us about Portland's Nob Hill?
Well, Portland's Nob Hill, the Northwest's most fashionable district, and I'd like to dedicate this presentation to Richard Marlett, who wrote the book that inspired it, actually, 19th Street. It's an incredible book. I do believe it's out of print, but if I were to recommend maybe 10 books on Portland history, this would probably make the top 5. And it's like a coffee table book. It's not even very big. This district, Nob Hill, was Portland's most fashionable district. For residential homes, almost certainly due to the Cooch family, historic family in Portland. I don't believe any of their descendants are still in Portland, but Captain John A. Cooch, he was a sea captain, and he annexed Cooch's addition to the city of Portland, and he platted all the streets himself, the street grid, and he lined up the streets with celestial bodies, stars and planets and such, because he was a navigator. And that's an interesting fact to remember. But he, when he had a number of daughters, and I forgot actually the number, but there were 5 or 6, and he set aside a large block in Cooch's addition, a large city block for each of his daughters to acquire and build a large house on when they married. So the house that we're looking at now, the Cicero Hunt Lewis House, the C.H. Lewis House, as it's sometimes called, as opposed to the C.S. Lewis House, which is a completely different story. But Cicero Hunt Lewis was the husband of one of Cooch's daughters, and he was a wealthy man. And well, you can see from his house, it was built in 1881. The style was stick/early Queen Anne. You can see the stick style influence in the gable at the front, over the bay, in like the gable apron and the design of the brackets. But it had a lot of elements of early Queen Anne also.
So let's break down this architectural style here. So we're looking at a stick style Queen Anne. Why is it called stick? Is there
called
anything
stick style because there's this geometric stick work, as it's called, like in that gable. It's also very chalet inspired with the low pitch of the gable.
Oh yeah, I can see that. It is actually very Swiss almost when you look at it in that way.
Kind of, and not visible in this picture. Well, barely visible actually. You can see a little bit of a pyramidal roof at the top, and that's actually 4 or 5 story. It's actually 4 stories. A belvedere that isn't visible in very many images, but it was built by the Lewises so that they could look at the city from afar.
And this is some amazing interior here.
Yeah, this represents the aesthetic movement style of interior design, and the aesthetic movement is characterized by very rich patterns, but tastefully elaborate patterns. There are dark woods. The staircase is very unique. The newel post, I've never seen one quite like it. But yeah, the drawing room, it's not the parlor, it's the drawing room that's shown at the bottom. That's a famous image. It was actually used as the frontispiece for Classic Houses of Portland, another great book that I would recommend. It shows the kind of furnishings that would have been typical of the period.
And is this house in existence today?
No.
Probably most of these houses are gone, right?
Yes. In fact, I think only 3 of them are still standing, and I'll point those out when I get to them.
If you go to Nob Hill today, what does it look like today?
It is mostly apartment buildings built in the 20s. Yes, these houses were torn down in the 20s. Some in the 30s. A couple of smaller 1800s and early 1900s houses that escaped the wrecking ball because they didn't have like big yards that could be developed. But anyway, this aesthetic movement, we're going to see more of it when we get to the Knapp House, the Richard B. Knapp House. So the Robert Bruce Wilson House, this is the only good photograph of it. The Wilson House was actually enormous. It was probably the largest house in Portland. It was fairly plain. Yes, Queen Anne, an interesting brand of Queen Anne, but we probably don't have time to talk about all its features. The architect is unknown. It doesn't really resemble anything else I've seen in Portland, so I almost think it was like outsourced, essentially. Robert Bruce Wilson was a doctor, I believe also a surgeon, very prestigious. Walter J. Burns was his son-in-law, and that Walter J. Burns house was built like a year after the Robert Bruce Wilson house, on the same block, just towards the front of the block. The Wilson house against the back of the street. Sorry.
You said the Queen Anne style, this Queen Anne style is rather plain, and I agree. It's not the kind of words you usually associate together, Queen Anne and plain, but this one is not.
I think it's attractive. It's just not like really. It's restrained.
Mm-hmm. It's lovely. It must have been gigantic, though. Do you have any idea the number of rooms?
Oh no, I'm guessing like 20 or something.
20 plus is what I'm thinking too, just looking at it. Okay, let's go on to another style.
Levi White House is Eastlake, well, with Queen Anne elements, or Queen Anne with Eastlake elements, I suppose you could say. Classic Houses of Portland includes it in the Eastlake chapter, the chapter dedicated to that style. Levi White, I forgot what he did. I think he was a merchant. He built the house in 1886. The architect was Justice Crumbine, and that's the first of these houses that was designed by Justice Crumbine.
Where did Eastlake start? that out there in the West Coast area?
Oh no, it started in England. There was an architect named Charles Eastlake. He actually hated what it turned into when it grew in the U.S. He did not like what his style developed into, and he did not like his name being put on it. Um, he was more of like early aesthetic movement design, kind of, and
What was his criticisms of of the U.S.'s deployment of
he
that
thought
style?
it was too elaborate. It wasn't well proportioned. It was mass produced. The whole idea of his
So
original
the
Eastlake.
typical criticisms Americans get for everything that we do. We overdo it.
Yeah.
We yeah, absolutely. Okay. Typical American. Got it. So this Justice guy, that's an interesting name. Was Justice, do you know anything more about Justice Crumbine other than he was related?
Well, he designed a lot of houses in Portland. He was a German immigrant. Um, there's only, I believe, one of his buildings still standing. Within my lifetime, there were 5 or 6 of his buildings still existing in Portland. Within my lifetime, and now there's only one.
Wow.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Was it all residential that you know of, or did he design something
No,
else?
actually, only one of the houses that was torn down within my lifetime was residential.
Okay. Okay, moving on. Levi Whitehouse. Next, Captain
Captain
George.
Flanders House. Yes, it was also designed by Justice Crumbine, and it was built a couple of years earlier in 1881, the same year as the Lewis House. It was a very interesting house, and the reason I put it right after the White House, not the White House, the Levi White House. The reason I put it right after that is because I believe that it had the same floor plan. Justice Crumbine, when he designed the Levi White House, reused the floor plan for the Flanders House.
How do you know that? Like, why are you saying that? Is it?
Well, the exteriors, even though they look very different, when you really look at them, the way, especially if you look at it from the corner, it becomes very obvious that the basic structure of the house is the same.
Okay, I'm going to flip back to the previous house that we're referring to. So this is the house you're saying is similar in layout to this house. They don't look super similar in those two pictures, but I'll take your word for it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. One more thing about the Levi White House. It was. I'll make this quick. I promise. It later became the North Pacific Sanatorium, which was like or Sanatorium, I think. It was like sort of a healing center, and they added a large wing to the back that's only visible in one picture, and it's neither.
So it's a sanatorium, not necessarily for sanity. It was a way. Yeah, it was that movement of health, and
yeah,
Kellogg was part of that movement, I believe. Right.
Yes.
Okay, understood. Okay, where are we at in this list?
G.V. James House, built in 1880, a year before the Flanders House and the Lewis House. It was a simple Italianate, very large. If you zoom into the picture and look at the size of the lady standing on the porch, I believe that she is G.V. James's daughter. If you really look at her, she only comes like a third of the way up that post. So either she was very short or this was a very enormous house. I'm guessing option 2 because of the fact that the stairs are so tiny, the steps, the risers, compared to the size of the house. So I think this was a massive, massive construction. The Rodney Gleason House. Now, this is one of the few houses in the book that I don't think was a very successful design. And it didn't really, I think it was designed quickly. It was Queen Anne, but it had elements that didn't quite work together. This, you can kind of see that the proportions are a little bit odd. It was built up on a hill that was artificially made, so it looked like it kind of loomed over everything. I mean, it's much better than modern construction, as these houses typically were, but it's not really a remarkable house.
It doesn't flow, does it? It kind of feels stacked.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The architect was probably just as Crumbine, but part of me thinks he wouldn't have stooped to that level.
Yeah. Well, it's still pretty to my eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, oh, yes, the Dr. Kenneth A.J. McKenzie House. This one is still standing.
Quite different looking than the previous styles we've been talking
That's
about.
what
This.
a lot of people remark when they see this. I think it's a fantastic design. It's Whidden and Lewis or McCaw and Martin. Some sources say it was Whidden and Lewis. Others say it was McCaw and Martin as the architects. But it doesn't matter. It's a gorgeous house. It's Richardsonian inspired. The dormers are very English Queen Anne rather than American Queen Anne. And the tower has almost federal style Muntin designs in the windows. But it all somehow comes together and works. And it has the largest collection, I believe, of wood carving in any interior in Oregon.
Wow.
It's incredible. The carving was done in Italy. H. Richardson was a Boston architect, I believe. Boston. I mean, I know he was an architect. I believe he lived in Boston because that's where most of his stuff was built. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but he built Trinity Church in Boston in the 1870s. I forgot the exact date, but it was way ahead of the game in architecture. In the 1870s, everybody was designing like high Victorian Gothic with like pointed arches and patterned brickwork. He had these bold, regal forms, large blocks of stone, enormous, exaggerated arches. He was a very eccentric person. He's sometimes dressed like a medieval monk, I've heard. And he loved everything medieval, and he adapted it to the Victorian era and its needs. And
when I see a Richardsonian Romanesque, I love it. It's just so masculine.
I do too. It's incredible. And whereas the Queen Anne style was often very feminine, the Richardsonian style was a masculine version of it. And H. Richardson died, unfortunately, before his style even became popular. It wasn't really until the 1890s that it took on its popularity, but it was mostly used for houses and churches and public buildings.
Did you say this one survived?
Oh yeah, it is. It's still there. It's actually, I believe, open to the public. I think it's owned by a Christian organization.
Well, that's something to look out for if you're in Portland and you
Yeah.
want to go see these things. One of them survived.
The Captain John A. Brown House. This house was built by an architect named Thomas J. Jones, who I know nothing about. I don't know anything else that he designed. I believe that he wasn't even a Portland native, because I know most of the architects of this period in Portland, and his name doesn't really ring a bell. When I was researching this, I found out that it was designed by Thomas Jones, and I'd never heard that name before. So it was built in 1895. It was, I think, a very attractive house. Richard Marlett did not think it was a very attractive house, and he said so in the book, 19th Street. But it was torn down after it had been moved by a group of preservationists to the site of the Lewis House. I always think the Levi White House, but it's the Lewis House. It was moved to the site of the Lewis House, which had previously been demolished, and it was going to be restored as a house museum, but they couldn't get the funds together, and it just rotted on site. And within a couple of years, it was demolished.
Yeah, these houses, there's a lot of wood in them. It seems. So if they're not maintaining them, it'll go quick, won't it?
Yeah. Thankfully, there are a lot of interior photos, but I didn't have time to include them here. The George F. Fusner House, designed by Edgar M. Lazarus. He designed a number of houses in Portland. It was built around 1900. It was covered almost entirely in shingles. It was basically shingle style, but it had some arts and crafts influences. I think it's a very attractive house. It's still standing.
Oh, wow. It is so different, isn't it? You can really see how the visual style changed.
Yeah, it did.
Between the 1880s, where you were going crazy, all this ornate stuff, 1900, look at this. Let's keep going here. So that was a good one. George H. Williams.
George H. Williams. His wife was very nuts. And she got involved in a scandal that involved a cult and ritual starvation. And I don't remember the exact details, so I'm not going to make it up, but it was sensationalized in the newspapers. She and a bunch of other Victorian ladies literally starved themselves to death inside the house because she got a vision from Jesus telling her to do it.
Wow, sounds sounds legit. Doesn't end well though when you do
No.
that.
But yeah,
That is a very ornate house.
yeah, it's kind of Flemish inspired. I would call it Queen Anne, but the parapets and the gable ends are very Flemish looking Dutch.
You can see that Flemish shape. Yep.
Yeah, it's a very unique house. I haven't seen another one from this period quite like it. The other features are basically Italianate. And the architect was Joseph Sherwin. If you live in Portland, you know Joseph Sherwin because he designed the Ladd Carriage House.
Oh, okay. Say that which carriage house again, because you cut out.
The Ladd Carriage House, which is almost the size of a house. It was the carriage house for another mansion that was not designed by him. The carriage house was built a little bit later. But the mansion's gone, but the carriage house is still standing, and it's a restaurant, I believe, a pub.
Very good.
If you come out here, you'd love it.
Oh, well, we'll have to make a time.
The Frank A. Knapp House was also designed by Whidden and Lewis. It's different than the McKenzie House, but you can see the shingles. It's shingle style, but the eaves look very prairie. And the porch is just almost stick style.
I would have gotten this confused with arts and crafts. Like I can't. It's hard to tell the difference for me.
Well, that's fair. That's fair to say. It looks kind of arts and crafts. The windows are craftsmen with the 6/1 Muntin design. This is the Henry E. Jones house. You notice it's also designed by Joseph Sherwin. And I think this is a masterpiece of architecture. The composition is spot on. Richard Marlett did not like this house, and he was a man of opinions. To quote him, he said, "It was the gaiety and hospitality that happened here that remained in persons' minds long after those little pointed gable ends vanished." But I think it's a gorgeous house personally. I think it's very well composed. It's very cohesive. It has a mixture of straight and curved elements, and I think it's very well done. This is the George Weidler house. There was another mansion built on this block that I didn't include a picture of because it was a virtual copy of the G.V. James house, and that would have been a waste of space. But the other mansion, the Charles P. Bacon house, was designed by Justice Crumbine, by Warren H. Williams, who designed this house. They were partners in the same firm, and though their architecture has distinct styles, where Crumbine went more Gothic often, and Williams went more like true Queen Anne. Here in this example, Williams is kind of doing the Crumbine thing and including a more Gothic-influenced Queen Anne house. And the Charles P. Bacon house was an exact copy of the G.V. James house, except it had Gothic arches on the first floor instead of round arches. This is probably the most elaborate house ever built in Portland, and possibly the most elaborate house ever built in the Northwest, at least in the Victorian era. It is the Richard B. Knapp House. It was built in 1882. The style was Queen Anne with a lot of Eastlake interiors and porch elements. The architect was Warren H. Williams. Now, it wasn't known until fairly recently that this was designed by Warren H. Williams. It was actually attributed to Justice Crumbine before this, but Warren H. Williams was the man who designed it.
Insane.
Yeah.
How long it
Just give them a second to look at this picture because there's a lot to take in.
I totally agree. I'm just looking at it.
You can see the George H. Williams house in the background with the tower to the left.
Oh,
no.
Yes, I see it. Oh, yeah. This was the one we just saw. Okay.
Yeah, they were all built near each other.
What a neighborhood.
Yeah. And the Knapp House, it's interesting to note, it had a lot of features. I'm not going to analyze all of them, but it had these interesting features that were actually fairly common during the late Victorian period. Um, it has a chimney that has windows in it, and the flues go between the window.
I see that. Look at that right there. That's
So
insane.
the fireplace has a window above it, and you're like, wait, how can that be? But they engineered it
Went
so that
around
it
the window and came back and went around the window. That's crazy. Wow. And look at these. Is this the carriage
it's
area
the
where
porte
they?
cochere, yeah.
What did you say? What were the words there?
Porte cochere or porte cochere. These are some of the interiors of the Nob House.
Amazing.
Thankfully, it was documented by a photographer named Minor White. He was a great photographer. He was commissioned by the Portland Art Museum to photograph this and one other house that's not included in this slideshow. And he took these detailed photos of the house to document it before it was torn down, like 10 years before it was torn down.
That is such a shame to lose that.
Yeah. The stained glass is not Povey Brothers, contrary to what a lot of people think. The Povey Brothers were known as the Tiffany of the Northwest. They were based in Portland. The stained glass, I don't know if it was Tiffany. It looks like some of Tiffany's work from that early period.
That does.
There's no saying for sure.
Incredible.
Certainly the Nabs could have afforded Tiffany.
Yeah, here's some more of it.
Yeah, and the Eastlake and the coffered ceilings is really apparent in the wood paneling.
Those copper ceilings.
Yeah. This is the staircase, and that room on the left is one of those windows above a fireplace.
Yeah, so there's the fireplace. There's your window. This almost looks Moorish. And
yeah, it's a Turkish filigree.
okay.
It had a lot of different exotic influences.
When was it torn down? Did you say?
1951, I believe.
Okay, we've moved on to some other houses here.
The Josiah Myrick House. Now, this is an interesting one because there are approximately 4 or 5 copies of this house throughout the city. It was a popular design. I don't know who designed it. I think it was likely a pattern book house. The Richard S. Perkins House, excuse me. I don't know who designed it, but I think it was likely Joseph Sherwin. And I'll tell you what, because what's it called? The balcony above the front bay, the gable end, that was very reminiscent of the Jones house. You see the little balcony that sticks out with the end of the gable above it in the arch.
Up here?
Right over the bay. It's similar. And the Captain John Couch house, this was actually Couch's own residence.
Wow, it's not as big as I expected.
No. Style was stick. It was a very good example of the stick style. I think it was attractive. I think that's one of his daughters on the steps.
So this is the guy who owned the land. This is a gigantic set of these neighborhoods were built.
Yeah, but he had a relatively modest house.
He did, yeah. And then how about this gay Lombard house here?
That was back when you would actually name your kid Gay. And it was built around 1890. The style's Queen Anne. We don't know the architect. I can't really... it doesn't resemble the work of any other architect I've seen in Portland. You can barely see in this image the carving work, the relief work in the gable end up there. It's incredible. And this house is actually still standing. It's painted,
oh, you can see this one?
Yeah, it's painted green.
Is this wood?
Yeah, it's wood.
Okay.
The plaster frieze is likely not original.
Yeah.
There was probably some sort of wood ornament there.
So this was not original, something wood there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm guessing. Possibly shingles, but I'm not sure.
Because it doesn't really match there, does it? It doesn't really.
No, it doesn't. Probably a 20s edition.
Probably.
Now, this is the J.K. Gill House, built in 1885. That was a little bit before the other shingle-style houses in Portland, which I think is interesting. I think it's a masterpiece of design. Very simple but effective. The architect is unknown. J.K. Gill was a department store owner in Portland. CEO of a large chain of department stores, which started out as like a single dry goods store on like Front Avenue or something. But he worked his way to the top and he built this house. He didn't live there for very long. You can see his granddaughter in the front yard. It kind of blends in with the foundation.
There she is.
Yeah. And it was torn down at an unknown date. The David S. Tuthill House, I believe that's the last one on our slideshow. It was built in about 1885. I'm guessing the style was Queen Anne, the architect unknown. Again, it doesn't really resemble anything of any architect I've seen. A lot of these houses, the plans have been lost, so there's no way of knowing who designed them. It was, I think, an attractive house. There are some better pictures of it, but I didn't have time to find those to hunt them down.
Wow, this has been a great tour of what would have been surely one of the most amazing neighborhoods in America.
Thank you.
In the 1800s.
Oh, believe me, this was not one of the most amazing neighborhoods in America.
Really?
There was Nob Hill in San Francisco. There was all of Newport, Rhode Island. There was Brush Park in Detroit. I can name about a million other ones that were way more spectacular than this. But this has a special place in my heart, so to speak, because it's Portland, my hometown.
Yeah, well, thank you for putting this together, Marvin, and thank you for taking the time to share with us your passion. I hope we can come back together and continue these architectural talks. I think it's really fun to see what you know and to hear the facts that you can share with us. And thanks for being a friend of our channel.
Thanks very much.
All right, and thanks for joining us, folks. If you've made it this far, you've learned some things. And I think we're going to sign off now. Thank you, Marvin.
Bye. Thank you, Matt, so much for hosting this. Bye.